Smoke hangs thick over a hillside in the Vermont countryside, and through it men are running, not away, but forward. It is late afternoon on August 16th, 1777, and the air itself seems to tremble with musket fire.
Hold the line! Push forward!
Exhausted militiamen, farmers, and blacksmiths and shopkeepers, only weeks removed from their ordinary lives, press up a slope toward a hastily built earthwork crowned with a single cannon. Inside that fortification, German dragoons in heavy leather boots and brass-fronted helmets realize almost all at once that the ring of armed men closing around them has no gaps left to escape through. Somewhere behind the American line, a broad-shouldered man on horseback, gray-eyed and weathered by 30 years of frontier warfare, watches the smoke lift just enough to see the enemy's position crumbling. His name is John Stark, and though almost no one beyond New Hampshire has heard of him, in the next few hours he is about to inflict one of the most complete tactical defeats the British Army will suffer in the entire Saratoga campaign. To understand how a retired militia general, a man who had walked away from the Continental Army in frustration only months before, ended up commanding this decisive moment, we have to go back and follow the long chain of events that led both armies to this smoke-covered hillside. By the summer of 1777, the American Revolution had already dragged on for more than 2 years, and Great Britain believed it had finally found the strategy that would end it. The plan was simple in concept, though difficult in execution. Split the rebellious colonies in two by seizing control of the Hudson River corridor, cutting New England off from the rest of the fledgling United States. If New England could be isolated, the thinking went, the rebellion there could be starved of support and crushed while the remaining colonies were pacified one by one. The man entrusted with the northern half of this plan was Lieutenant General John Burgoyne, a confident and ambitious officer who had convinced London that a bold thrust south from Canada could reach Albany before the year was out. Burgoyne's army, which set out from Quebec in June, was formidable on paper. Thousands of British regulars, German auxiliaries hired from Brunswick and Hesse-Hanau, Loyalist volunteers, Canadian militia, and allied native warriors, all moving south along Lake Champlain toward the Hudson. At first, Burgoyne's campaign seemed to justify his confidence. Fort Ticonderoga, long regarded as a key American stronghold, fell to the British almost without a fight in early July, and for a moment it appeared Burgoyne's predictions of rapid success might come true. But beneath that early triumph, serious problems were already taking root. Burgoyne's army was enormous and slow, dragging an oversized baggage train through dense wilderness where roads barely existed. Horses were desperately needed to move artillery and supplies, and as the army pushed further from Canada, its supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Food, forage for animals, and fresh horses were all running short, and the deeper Burgoyne advanced into hostile territory, the harder it became to replenish them. It was this growing desperation, not tactical brilliance, but plain logistical necessity, that would soon draw his army toward a small town in the Vermont hills called Bennington, where American storehouses were rumored to hold exactly what his army needed most. Before we go further into that fateful decision, it's worth pausing to understand the man who would rise to stop it. If you're enjoying this story so far, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, because the tale of what happened next deserves to be remembered far more widely than it currently is. John Stark was born in 1728 in Londonderry, New Hampshire, and grew up on a frontier that offered little room for softness. As a young man, he was captured by Abenaki raiders and lived among them for weeks before being ransomed, an experience that gave him an unusually intimate understanding of the wilderness warfare that would define much of his later career. During the French and Indian War, Stark served with distinction in Rogers Rangers, the elite unit famous for ambushes, long-range scouting, and brutal winter campaigning through terrain that broke lesser soldiers. He earned a reputation among his men not as a polished parade ground officer, but as someone who understood how real fighting worked in the forests and hills of North America. Someone who led from experience rather than theory, and who never asked his men to endure anything he had not already endured himself.
Hold steady, lads! Fire!
When the Revolutionary War began, Stark answered the call immediately, leading New Hampshire troops at Bunker Hill in 1775, where his steady defense of the rail fence position helped inflict devastating casualties on advancing British regulars. He continued serving through the difficult campaigns of 1776, including the retreat from New York and the attack on Trenton. But in early 1777, Stark's military career nearly ended over a matter of pride and principle. When Congress promoted several officers he considered his juniors over him, passing him by for advancement he felt he had earned through blood and service. Stark resigned his commission in the Continental Army in protest. He returned home to New Hampshire, frustrated and, by most accounts, prepared to leave military life behind entirely. It seemed for a time that one of the most capable frontier commanders of the war had simply walked away from it. But history rarely lets capable men rest for long. As Burgoyne's invasion pressed south through the summer of 1777, and the threat to New England became undeniable, the New Hampshire legislature turned to Stark, offering him command of a new state militia force with an unusual condition. He would answer only to New Hampshire's own authorities, not to the Continental Congress that had slighted him. It was an arrangement built specifically around his grievance, and it worked. Stark accepted, and within weeks he had rallied roughly 1,500 militiamen, ordinary citizens who trusted him precisely because he was one of them. A man who understood irregular warfare, who led with blunt honesty rather than aristocratic distance, and who inspired loyalty through shared hardship rather than rank alone. Stark was no flawless hero. He was stubborn, proud, and quick to bristle at perceived insult. But those very qualities, tempered by decades of frontier experience, made him exactly the kind of commander who could turn undisciplined farmers into an effective fighting force on short notice. Meanwhile, Burgoyne's supply crisis was reaching a breaking point. Acting on faulty intelligence that suggested the region around Bennington was lightly defended and rich with horses, cattle, and stores, Burgoyne dispatched a mixed force of roughly 800 men under Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Baum, a German officer commanding dismounted dragoons alongside British light troops, Loyalist volunteers, Canadian militia, and a contingent of native warriors. Baum's orders were straightforward: march to Bennington, seize the supplies gathered there, and return to reinforce the main army. What Burgoyne's command failed to grasp was just how badly they had misjudged the situation. Reports of American strength in the area were badly outdated, and no one in the British camp appreciated how quickly Stark's militia, along with reinforcements arriving from the Green Mountain Boys and neighboring Massachusetts and Vermont communities, were assembling in response. When the smoke finally cleared and the last shots faded into the Vermont dusk, the scale of the American victory became clear. Casualty and prisoner figures compiled by historians in the following years indicate the British and German forces suffered several hundred killed, wounded, and captured, representing a devastating loss for Burgoyne's already stretched army.
Fire! Do not reload! Cannons, fire now!
American forces captured significant quantities of muskets, ammunition, and supplies, along with artillery pieces abandoned in Bryman's retreat. Precisely the kind of material losses that a supply-starved invading army could least afford. Before we move into the aftermath and legacy of this remarkable victory, if you've found value in this deep dive into an overlooked chapter of the Revolution, please consider liking this video and sharing your thoughts below. It genuinely helps bring stories like Stark's to a wider audience. The consequences of Bennington rippled outward far beyond the immediate battlefield. For Burgoyne, the loss of nearly 1,000 men he could not replace, combined with the destruction of the supply expedition that was meant to relieve his logistical crisis, represented a serious blow at precisely the moment his campaign could least absorb one. Word of the American victory spread quickly through New England and beyond, and the effect on morale was immediate and significant. Militia enlistments surged in the weeks following Bennington, as word spread that Burgoyne's supposedly invincible army could be defeated by ordinary citizen soldiers under determined leadership. This influx of reinforcements would prove critical in the weeks ahead, as American forces under General Horatio Gates continued to gather strength against Burgoyne's steadily weakening army. Historians examining the broader Saratoga campaign consistently point to Bennington as one of the crucial turning points that set the stage for Burgoyne's eventual surrender at Saratoga in October of 1777. Deprived of the supplies and reinforcements he had desperately needed, and facing a growing American force emboldened by victories like Stark's, Burgoyne found his position increasingly untenable as autumn approached. When Burgoyne finally surrendered his entire army at Saratoga, The shockwaves of that defeat convinced France that the American cause was viable enough to warrant open military support, a diplomatic shift that would prove essential to the revolution's ultimate success. Bennington, in this sense, was not merely a standalone victory, but a critical link in the chain of events that led directly to that far more famous turning point. For his role in the victory, Congress, the same body Stark had resigned from in frustration only months earlier, awarded him a commission as a brigadier general in the Continental Army, a recognition that quietly resolved the very grievance that had driven him from service. Stark continued serving through the remainder of the war, though no later engagement would match the singular impact of his stand at Bennington. He lived to a remarkable old age, dying in 1822 at 93. One of the last surviving general officers of the Revolutionary generation, remembered in New Hampshire as a defining figure of the state's revolutionary history, with towns, monuments, and the state's own motto, "Live free or die," drawn from a letter Stark wrote decades after the battle, carrying his legacy forward. Yet, despite its importance, Bennington remains one of the lesser-known engagements of the Revolutionary War, often overshadowed by the larger and more famous battles at Saratoga that followed so closely afterward. Historians who study the campaign closely understand what many casual accounts miss: that without Stark's victory on that smoke-covered hillside in August of 1777, the outcome at Saratoga, and perhaps the trajectory of the entire war, might have unfolded very differently. A retired general, passed over and pushed aside, returned to answer his homeland's call and delivered one of the most complete tactical victories of the war, and in doing so, helped set in motion the events that would ultimately secure American independence. It is a story that deserves to be remembered not as a footnote to Saratoga, but as one of its essential foundations, and it is a story of an ordinary frontier soldier who, when history called on him one final time, answered without hesitation.